So, hi everyone, and welcome to our salon with Cassie Holmes. So, I am Matt Bateman. I know a couple of you. I don't think I know most of you, but I am a philosopher and educator that works at a startup called Higher Ground Education. We're a Montessori education startup. I am the husband to Gena Gorlin, who is to my right on my screen, who's a clinical psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin, and who has like 4 jobs and does all sorts of amazing things with founders and clients and other things like that. And we are both parents to a 2-year-old who was born right before the pandemic hit, and we are about to be we're parents to a negative 3-month-old-ish. Like we're expecting again in January. And so we are between my startup life and Gena's startup plus professor life and our parenting, incredibly intimately familiar with challenges of priorities and time management, and not just time management, but kind of like broader than that, what Cassie calls timecraft, kind of trying to build a coherent experience or mosaic out of all of the things that you're doing in a way that is that you're at peace with, and that adds up to something that you want in your life. Ongoing challenge. And of course, we have the guest of honor, Cassie Holmes. Welcome, Cassie.
Thank you.
Cassie is a psychologist. She was formerly a professor at Wharton at UPenn, at my graduate alma mater, and now she is at the UCLA Anderson School of Management. She's a professor of business. And her research is on happiness and time, on all sorts of aspects of it, on extraordinary versus ordinary experiences, on getting the most out of our time. It's very practically oriented, as you will see if you read her book. So you should definitely read her book. She's also author of the book that's right next to her, Happier Hour, which Gena and I have been enjoying over the last few weeks too. So thank you so much for joining us, Cassie.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And you guys can feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Thank you so much for coming. We're excited about this conversation. Gena and I are just going to kick it off with some questions, but we will also periodically go to you, and feel free to use the hand raising function if you have something that you're dying to say, and we will get to you pretty quickly. You can also use the chat. One or both of us will monitor the chat. And this is also being recorded, just FYI. Anything that I should add, Anna?
No, I think, yeah, I mean, use the hand raise feature just so we don't have people speaking at the same time. And yeah, just welcome. I'm just an attendee here, but this is just an extra privilege to me. And Cassie, I'm so glad that you're joining us and you're getting this super duo of beloved Interintellect members, hosts as your host, who have never before hosted together. So this is history. We're making history here. And I'm just super excited to learn from you tonight.
Yeah, my entire marriage is a basically failing project to not work together with Gena. So thanks for that.
Happy to say it is failing on every front.
So why don't we just start off, Cassie? Why don't you just tell us a little bit about your story and your project and the problem that you're trying to solve? Obviously, you're very interested in issues of overwhelm and time management and how they add up to happiness or unhappiness. And my sense from reading your book is that this is me search for you. So maybe you can also just tell us a little bit about how you came to this project.
Absolutely. And it is such a treat. I know Anna said that it is good evening. It is good morning for me. I'm here in California. And I actually closed out of the chat because I found that I was reading about you guys, and which had pulled me out of our conversation. So I apologize. I saw who some of you guys were, but I'm going to focus on who I see in this conversation. And then we'll rely on Matt and Gena to pull in sort of questions or context from the chat, if you don't mind. But yes, I study happiness, and in particular, the role of time. And what's really sort of interesting about that is that I used to have to motivate why happiness is important. And I'll also first say that what I mean by happiness is the joy that we experience in our days. So it's that experience within, as well as the satisfaction or happiness we feel about our lives. So there's also this cognitive evaluative component. And before the pandemic and being at a business school, I used to have to sort of make the case for why happiness is important. But sadly, given that anxiety rates, depression rates, burnout rates are as high as they are, nobody takes emotional well-being for granted anymore. But there are lots of studies that show the positive effects of feeling happy and being happy. And I can certainly share those, but I feel like I don't have to anymore because you all know. Also, the pandemic taught us that we can't take our time for granted either. You know, the hours of our days sum up to the years of our lives. And the pandemic showed us just how fragile life is. And so seems like everyone is trying to figure out now how to invest our hours so that we feel a greater sense of meaning and satisfaction in our life. And that is what I've been studying throughout my career, and what the book, I've been working for longer than the pandemic on this book, but I'm so happy that it's ready now to answer these questions that so many folks are grappling with. And I will say that I live it. So not only have I conducted research to ask the questions and answer the questions, but I also apply the learnings from my research to my own life. And have benefited from it. I am happy because of it. But that wasn't always the case. And one of the experiences that I had that really propelled this research agenda and the book is a story that I shared to open the book. And this was earlier in my career when I was on the faculty as assistant professor at Wharton. And it was just one of these crazy days that I'm sure so many can relate to, that I got up early that morning to go to New York to present research, and my presentation was sandwiched within these back-to-back meetings. And then I had this networking sort of colleague dinner. And then I was rushing to get the very last train that would get me home to my 4-month-old and my husband back in Philly. And I remember so vividly on the train that night, sort of looking out the window. And as the darkness was sort of whizzing by in a blur, I was like, I don't know if I can keep up between the pressures of work, of wanting to be a good parent, wanting to be a good partner, wanting to be a good friend, the never-ending pile of chores. I was just so stressed, so overwhelmed, and unhappy. And I wanted more time, not just to get more done, but I wanted more time so that I could like slow down and actually experience the time that I was spending. And in that sort of depleted, unhappy state, I was like, well, clearly the answer is that I have to quit. I have to quit my job because this isn't sustainable. And I would like move to, like, I had this fantasy, which I'm sure so many people have in those crazy days of like, I'm going to quit and go like hang out on an island somewhere and like sip on margaritas all day. And then I would be happier because I'd have a whole lot more time to relax and do whatever I wanted. But then I was like, all right, well, before I sort of march into my chairman's office and tell him that I'm quitting my dream job that I've worked so hard for, I was like, this is actually an empirical question as a social psychologist. So to be clear, I'm a social psychologist, not a clinical psychologist like Gena. So I look at patterns across people and how in sort of environmental situational factors influence behavior and judgment. And I was like, the question of like, are people who have a whole lot more time happier is an empirical question. And I was like, I should figure out whether having a whole lot more time would make me happy before I quit. And so I, before quitting, making that decision, we conducted several studies. So I recruited some of my favorite collaborators, and among our studies, we analyzed data from the American Time Use Survey, which looks at tens of thousands of working and non-working Americans, how they spent a regular day. And from that, we calculated how much time they spent on discretionary activities and related that to their reported life satisfaction. And from that, we saw something really interesting. It was the pattern of results was an inverted U shape. So with too little time, people are less happy. So on one side, it's down. Like that was me on the train. That was all of you who can relate to those crazy, hectic days. But then what was interesting was on the other side, we found that there was such thing as having too much time. That is, people with a whole lot of discretionary time, in this data set, it happened to be more than approximately 5 hours, were also less happy. And digging into that, it turns out that we are driven to feel productive. We are averse to being idle. And so when we spend the hours of our days upon days with nothing to show for how we spent those hours, it undermines our sense of purpose and decreases our satisfaction. And also recognizing, so that was actually, as someone who does find purpose and fulfillment in the work that I do when I'm not so crazy with the time pressure, I was like, okay, so the answer isn't to quit my job. And also looking at the pattern of data, I sort of like at the extremes, it went down, but there's a whole swath of folks where there was no relationship. The relationship was flat between the amount of discretionary time people have and their happiness. And so what that suggests is that actually it's not about how much time you have available in your days to spend how you want. It's really investing that time on particular activities and how you engage in that time that determines our happiness. And so that is actually, instead of quitting my job, I sort of redirected my research agenda to try to figure that out. Okay, so if it's not about being time rich, it's about making the time we have rich. How do we make the time we have rich? How should we be spending our time so that at the end of the day, we're looking back and instead of feeling depleted and overwhelmed and unhappy, we look back and even if busy, you feel fulfilled and satisfied. And so that is what propelled my research and also ultimately to develop a course that I've been teaching among our MBAs at UCLA and executive MBAs that's called Applying the Science of Happiness to Life Design. And I've been teaching that for 4 years now, seeing the effect of these learnings and these exercises and assignments on my students, both in their days as well as sort of hearing in years since then how it's continued to affect their lives. When I was approached to write a book, I was like, yes, because these learnings can then reach more people. And that is what Happier Hour is all about. It's answering based off of my empirical research as well as that of colleagues in my field. But it's not hopefully a super boring dry read. There's story, both my own stories as well as stories and anecdotes from my students to make it more digestible and relatable, hopefully, to help folks do exactly what folks are trying to figure out how to do, how to invest the hours of their days to feel satisfied and fulfilled in their weeks and about their lives.
So Cassie, so first of all, definitely not boring. We were just discussing before everyone got on the call that I've spent much of the week just crying in my car while listening to the audiobook of A Happier Hour, all constructive and ultimately I would even say happy tears, but
I know when you first said that I was like
happy tears, all happy tears. Yeah, happy and also reflective, and as Matt will attest, has already urged all kinds of actionable changes in myself and in our date night routine, etc. Can I jump in though with a question, or maybe it's a meta question to hopefully kind of frame some of the discussion? I'll frame this primarily from a clinical perspective because I'm a clinical psychologist and I think about these things so often from a clinical standpoint. And in clinical contexts, when we hear talk of obligatory tasks, when we hear talk of shoulds, talk of have tos, that immediately alerts us as clinicians. Like that's a kind of source of suspicion. Like, what do you mean you should? What do you mean you have to? Have to, according to whom and for the sake of what? And in service of which of your goals and values and needs? Like, is there anything you in fact actually have to do other than whatever that old saying, pay taxes and die, speaking of death, as maybe the one non-negotiable have to. But I wondered, and as I was reading, the early chapters and reading about some of the research you cited, that you just summarized about how people experience obligatory versus discretionary tasks, and thinking, it isn't part of the problem that they're even framing all of these tasks as obligatory, and that isn't there something about this whole framing that's a kind of false dichotomy? And then later in the book, I actually thought you addressed that so beautifully. Like, you brought in self-determination theory, and the idea that having that sense of autonomy and agency over our lives is critical, and that we can actually turn our work into a source of chosen value and time well spent, and both that we can say no to things that we think we have to do, and that we can do the things we're doing in a much more chosen way. So I guess I would love to just hear you riff on that. Like, do we even want that distinction in our heads, or should we be thinking about it differently?
Yeah, and we don't want that distinction in our heads. And also because notably, the very same activity can, for different people, feel like something they want to do, whereas someone else feels like it's something they have to do. But also, even within the same person, that activity can sometimes feel like a want and sometimes feel like a should. And we use the discretionary activities as a way to operationalize in our examination, to test the question of what's this relationship between the amount of time someone has, and notably, it's not just empty time, it's not just available time. And we're like, how do we make it so that it is, because what's available time mean? And so we went to great lengths to try to be really conservative in what we actually counted as discretionary activities. And with that, for that, we pre-registered that we would count any activity that more than 90% of people said was discretionary as discretionary. Our pattern of results held even when we sort of made that more lenient and counted any activity that more than 75% of people said was discretionary. So I don't think that it helps us to rely on that distinction. We used it to operationalize, and oftentimes that is what folks are thinking about. But I think what's more helpful is identifying for oneself individually, what are those worthwhile activities versus not worthwhile. And I think that identification is much more helpful, because what's worthwhile can show up in sort of quote unquote wants or quote unquote shoulds. But in order to make it worthwhile, like the distinction that I actually think that would help us is to maximize the time we spend on worthwhile activities, minimize the time we spend on what feels like waste. And importantly, I don't want to be the one to tell each individual what's worthwhile versus a waste. And actually, that's where a lot of I share the research that sort of starts pointing to some patterns that identify ways of spending time that tend to, and on average, our experiences more worthwhile. But really, it's the assignments in my class and exercises in the book, and I have a number of them, to help folks go through those steps to identify for themselves what are those worthwhile ways of spending, what are those wasteful ways of spending. The time tracking exercise is really helpful for that. Even reflecting on those experiences that bring you joy, that's another exercise, as well as even an exercise that helps people identify their purpose. And this is the 5 whys exercise, like what motivates you and ultimately drives you in both the work that you do, but I think even more generally sort of drives you in life. What is your sort of higher order goal, such that then that helps you also identify ways of spending time that are in line with that and in service of that. And that those activities might fall in the should categories, or it might fall in the, want categories, but it's really about what's worthwhile versus wasted.
And it sounds like what's intentional versus just on autopilot. It probably also tracks that distinction, right? Or kind of what is purposeful and what is like habit driven and unreflective. Like that seems like an important, maybe closely related dimension. Like there's just a lot we do on autopilot.
Yeah. And so that can come into play in two ways. It can come into play in both the activities that you spend your time on, that those that you're sort of proactive about making time for and spending time on, versus sort of mindlessly letting these activities fill your time. But also it's picking up, and actually I think this is where the true benefit, it's both of these, identifying the activities and spending time on them, but also when you're spending that time engaging in such a way that you're getting the most out of that time. And so it's intentional, both from the perspective of prioritizing activities that matter, but also intentional by paying attention during those activities. And I talk a lot in the book, and there's a lot of research that shows the sort of happiness defeating effects of being distracted and being pulled out of the moment. And we are so often distracted. Research shows that we are distracted, not thinking about what we're currently doing, almost half of the time, 47% of the time. And that's across activities, like types of activities, both wants and shoulds, and, fun and not fun. And so that's actually, if you've taken this step of being intentional about spending your time in a worthwhile way, but you're not even paying attention while doing it, then that's a missed opportunity for happiness, as well as it almost itself turns into a waste of time because you didn't actually even experience the time that you just spent.
So I'm going to pause us, and I will take a long sip of coffee, and I will see if anybody wants to say anything, and then I will ask another question.
While you do that, I will take a very hydrating sip of water, because again, it's probably too early for me to drink wine. I see David is drinking white wine, and it's making me excited for this afternoon, Friday afternoon.
For your date night that we know you have firmly scheduled for this evening.
Exactly.
We all know your schedule now, Cassie.
I know, honestly, in reading this book, you know a whole lot about me and my children and my husband. And he's not actually working from here today, or else I could bring him in to show him just as how good of a conversationalist he is, but unfortunately he's not.
I seriously entertained, just for fun, introducing you as like, this is Cassie, she was left at the altar.
I know. Even people like friends who have read the book, they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know. I'm like, well, now you and everybody.
It's a great way to update people all in one fell swoop, right? And to really own the narrative. Okay. That's funny.
That's all science books, like Alice and Bob. Yeah, no, it's not Alice and Bob. That's you and your wife.
And I don't even try to veil it with other names. I'm like, this is it. This is the mess of it.
So I thought, just while we're on it, since you were mentioning distraction, I'm sure this is going to be on a lot of people's minds, and I'm sure you get this question like every single class that you teach and every single podcast that you do, but here it is again, my version of it. So I started grad school in 2005, 2006. And I remember at the beginning of grad school, the experience of at Logan Hall in UPenn, like waiting for the elevator, and I was waiting for the elevator, and I would like think about my thesis, or like think about a seminar that had just happened or whatever. I would think about things when I was waiting for the elevator. By 2012, when I graduated, when I was standing in front of the elevator, I would just reflexively pull out my phone. And I'm not even sure, like I'm kind of presenting it in a way where people are going to naturally be like, that's awful. I'm not even sure it is awful, but the kind of there's a difference in kind of the affordance that we now have, given that we all have like an amazing hyper-connected distraction machine in our pockets. How big of a deal is that? Like that specific, like technology, social media, smartphones, like that. I mean, it's and you know, I hear everything in terms of how people talk about it. From you talk about this in your book a lot, and I hear everything in terms of how people talk about it from like, this is like, you know, digital heroin and distraction heroin, to like, you know, no, it can actually help us connect. And I mean, what's your take on all of this?
Yeah, it both. Like from a distraction standpoint, it is terrible. It is absolutely pulling us out of all of our moments. It's making us not have time to think, not have time to create. And it also actually, depending, and then, so, but there is like, I can speak quite a bit about this. So, but I also, depending on how it's used, it can be really connecting. And the research shows that when people, for social media, let's just start with that. When people use social media, actually as more normally they do, passively, where you're watching other people's lives, versus actively engaging with the connections and people in your life, and it's just the technology that affords you the ability to do that. That's where you see these divergent effects. So when you use it passively, then it actually decreases self-esteem, decreases happiness, like mood. It makes it increases negative mood. It increases loneliness. And it actually, there is some work that sort of speaks to it even more significantly, like being more likely to be depressed. But when people use it in a way to engage with the folks in their life and stay connected, then you actually see that it makes people feel more connected. And from that sense of connection, it actually increases happiness. From a distraction standpoint, so from a distraction, so it, in terms of whether it's a good versus bad use of time to be on social media, depends on how you're using it, but also the amount of time that you're spending, right? Because if you're spending a lot of time on this, in this particular activity, and you feel really busy and like you don't have time for these other activities that are really sort of more fulfilling and worthwhile, then that's your obvious question, that it is absorbing time that you could otherwise spend better. From a distraction standpoint, it's actually really important to be aware of. And it's not so dire though, because it's really easy to address. And the way that you address the effects is by creating no phone zones. So the very first, so in my course, it's a 10-week course, and each week my students have an experiential assignment. And then they do the assignment and then reflect on how it made them feel. The very first week, the assignment is a digital detox. So for 6 hours to get off of your phone, like no phone in the vicinity, get
6
off.
hours. It's ridiculous.
Well, are you saying like it's a lot or a little? Like my students,
that's a lot.
Freak out. Yes, they totally freak out.
But
And
I'm saying that like tongue in cheek, but also like that is actually my emotional reaction. Like 6 hours is a long time.
And there's a lot of anxiety going into it, because it's like this, like, oh my gosh, what if someone needs to reach me? Oh my gosh, I won't be able to be productive. And that's that anxiety going into it. But then it's interesting because all of my students sort of follow the same emotional cadence while doing it. That first hour is actually continues to be anxiety producing, and people are like automatically sort of reaching, as you said, Matt, like when you're waiting at an elevator now, you're just sort of without thinking, pull out your phone. So people sort of without thinking are sort of reaching, but the phone's not there. So, but then once that sort of nervousness of like, what am I missing out on, subsides, then you get this like really beautiful experience where you're disconnected, or you, by removing that distraction, it allows you to fully connect in what you're doing, and whom you're with. So it actually, and then you also see that people end up being more productive because they don't have that sort of like distraction away and easy sort of things to do to keep you from those sort of bigger projects or deeper thinking that you want to do, or that are sort of waiting for your attention. And so folks actually sort of fully engage, more fully engage. Now, there's also work that shows that in the role of distraction, it's not just like having your phone and being on it. The mere presence of your phone is distracting. So there was an interesting study that was conducted among friends dining together. This is a worthwhile activity. It makes people happy, social connection. And what they had in the experiment, they had a cover story to either have people leave the phone on the table while they're dining, face down, or to put their phone away out of sight. And what they found was that the folks even with the phone simply on the table reported enjoying their dining experience less because they felt less engaged. And because the reason is like when you even see the phone, it's drawing your attention to all the other things you could be doing. Like you're thinking about those social media feeds where you're watching people's lives and they're always in their like happiest, most social moments, like, you know, like on vacation somewhere with their friends, or like at a concert or at a dinner, or, you know, and those are all the things that you could be doing. And then you're also thinking about all the things you should be doing on your phone, like catching up on email or ordering your kids' supplies from Amazon or whatever it is. So it is pulling you out of the time that you're currently spending. It's funny, I know that some folks have new babies here. A woman that I had read my book, she was saying that it was like this sort of funny realization that she was like, when I'm at home, like with my baby and he's playing with his toys, I'm like on my phone looking up what toys he should be playing with at that what toys I should be ordering for his developmental stage, fully missing out on those moments of playing with her child. And so that is actually like a sort of very clear example of our phones pulling us out of moments that we are currently spending, and therefore undermining not only our engagement and happiness from it, but also our showing up for the other people that we're with, and our kids, our friends, whomever we are with when we are on our phone. That is absolutely communicating to them that I am not paying attention to you. My mind is somewhere else. And that's really affecting in a really bad way and disconnecting.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really hard. I mean, I think it's, when you say that it's easy to address, and in a way, it like tactically, I think it is. Like in practice, I think that the way that Gena and I address it is to take turns nagging each other, which is.
But the reason it's so easy, it's not like saying, don't have your phone ever. It is going back to Gena's point about intentionality. It's like, okay, we are going into an activity that is fun and happy. We are going to have dinner together, whether it's a date or whether it's sort of a family dinner, or whether it's taking your little one to the park, that it's a defined activity. And if you're like, okay, and you both agree, we're going to make this a no phone zone. And then so the phones go away, and it's for that period of time. It's not saying like always have your phone away. And so that is actually, even that agreement is really lovely, because it's this commitment to each other, but also just sort of appreciating each other and being like, I'm excited about this time with you. And it's like an invitation for really sort of connecting and genuine and present time. And so it doesn't have to be nagging of like, you put your phone away, but it's like, all right, this is going to be something fun that we're going to do together, this activity, let's make it a no phone zone. And then it's like, yeah, because it's about
Matt's deliberately downplaying our intentionality about this. We actually have a pot that we have dedicated to the putting away of our phones. Granted, we don't actually utilize it as regularly as I know we both want to and ought to, but we do have some intentional strategies, and Matt's the better of the two of us at enforcing them.
The pod is like it's like a natural Faraday cage. So when you put our phones in it, it's like they can't get a signal, and so
that's false, but sure,
no,
sure, sweetie.
It doesn't even need that though. It's just putting the phone.
Well,
in the
if
pot
you've got a watch, you need it.
Yeah,
that's
it's
true.
great.
There's that. Yeah, you got to also put the watch in sleep mode. Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, the
Anna,
no phone zone, my sister-in-law, who's actually in, as an example, in chapter 8 of the book, she actually, in implementing the strategies, she said this was the thing that was most life-changing. It was all of a sudden her evenings, or like their family evenings, with no phone zones, and now her kids ask for it. It's almost like her kids are asking for her attention because these no phone zone evenings were so fun and engaging. And instead of the sort of routine of like dinner on the table and TV on and, you know, homework or whatever, it was like, oh, the no phone zone evenings, like that's instead of like, we're going to play a game. And that is like people are engaged. And at the table, it's like, oh, real dinner together. It's like, this is where we talk. And she said that in just the first week of their no phone zone evenings, and actually now they have reduced, it's not every evening, it's actually three evenings. So it is that intentionality. But she said in that initial week of implementing it, she felt like she got to know her children more than she had in like 3 years, which just goes to show. And like, she's a very engaged, like, it's not like she's a negligent and absentee mom. It's just, she's busy, you know, like she's working in the busyness of life, but just creating those hours of space where no one is distracted by their phones, creates opportunity for incredible connection and conversation and fun, right?
Anna in the chat.
That's why Jenna is crying on the train. These are the parts I can tell. Am I correct?
Among many.
I know. There's a lot more as we start talking about death.
Anna in the chat and
we're
Amy
gonna
chimed in
touch
to say that she agreed, says that she couldn't sleep for years and then put her phone on airplane mode, and that she wakes up to 500 notifications when she turns it on, but it's like up to her when she turns it on. And just that kind of like one layer of intentionality makes a big difference.
I learned from a friend of mine who works at one of the European institutions in Brussels, and like she was a very like worried sleeper like myself, and she told me that, you know, she has a boss who will just like work all night and send her 700 emails, and she would try to go to sleep, but she would know that every hour that she sleeps, she's missing out, and she's giving herself work, right? Because the emails keep coming in, and there was this constant temptation to always just stay up and just like, you know, siege mode, respond to everything real time. And I was like, my life is very similar. I lead a community. I'm a solo founder of a startup. I work in 5 time zones. Like, I go to sleep in the Andy Grove way, you know, like I stop working when I'm tired, not when I'm done. I'm never done, says Andy Grove, who's also from Budapest, like me. And I thought, oh my God, what if I just like put my phone on plane mode? And I'm not kidding you. I've been sleeping like a baby for the past couple of years that I've been doing this, because I know in the morning I wake up, I look at my phone because my alarm goes off, but I'm not looking at all the emails immediately. I only look at this empty phone with just the alarm, and I decide when I'm ready to look at the world. And this has been the biggest life hack so far. And so this really resonates with me, because I think this is like this little idea, and it's many, many variations.
Taylor?
Hi, I just wanted to share another airplane mode story. My boyfriend travels a bit for work, and he is very open with his colleagues at this point about the fact that even if there is Wi-Fi on the plane, he will not be using it because he is on the plane and therefore is out of contact. And like he's like there's Wi-Fi, oh, that's nice. Not for me. And I thought that was kind of funny, and a similar sort of deliberate I'm not reachable right now kind of action.
I love that.
Yeah,
I do on planes as well. I'm watching Julia and Julia for 15 hours from Frankfurt to San Francisco. I'm sorry, I'm not achievable. But from the recipients end, it's really weird when somebody's like, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing emails because I'm traveling. Say people who fly from Chicago to New York, and they make it sound like they're taking an ocean cruiser to Newfoundland in like, I don't know, 1895. And now I'm traveling for 4 months at sea and I'm not available. No, you're on the plane and you're still tweeting from it. We know where you are. Please respond to the email.
Yeah, but I think it is important for folks to set their boundaries. And when it does come into this role of we can always be connected, it doesn't mean that we should always be connected. And it's up to us to prioritize time that's important to us. And that pushes out some of this time that it is responding to emails and being on social media or even on your phone. And it's interesting because it does sometimes need that communication from your part. It's like, as a heads up, I will not be available. So Taylor, your boyfriend sort of like claims plane time as that, but folks can claim anytime. Like it's absolutely appropriate to claim your weekends as time that you will not be responding to work. Of course, like Anna, to your point, the work is never done. There's always more to do. So the onus is on you. And I think it's actually, I share this analogy, which I think is very helpful in the book. And it's actually represented really nicely in a short film that I share on the first day of my course. And so in the film, a professor walks into his classroom, and on the desk, he puts a large clear jar. And then from a bag, he pulls out golf balls and he pours the golf balls into the jar, and they reach the very top. And he asks the students, is the jar full? And the students nod their head, and it's like, nope. And then from the bag, he pulls out pebbles and he pours the pebbles into the jar, and those pebbles fill the spaces around the golf balls up to the very top. And he asks the students, is the jar full? And the students are like, yes. And it's like, nope. And then like from the bag, he pulls out sand and he pours the sand into the jar, and the sand fills the spaces between the golf balls, between the pebbles up to the very top. And he asked the students, is the jar full? And by this point, they're like laughing and they're like, yes, the jar is full. And there was like one more step, and he pulls out 2 bottles of beer, opens one, pours it into the jar, opens the other, and sort of goes and takes a sip and perches on the front of the desk and explains, the jar is the time of your life. The golf balls are all the things that really matter. Your relationships with your family, your friendships, your passions. The pebbles are the other things that are sort of part of your life and matter, like your job, your house. The sand is everything else. The sand is all of that stuff that fills your time, like your phone responding to emails, like social media scrolling, whatever the sand is for you. But like notably, and it's really important to know, is had he put the sand in the jar first, all of the golf balls would not have fit. And that goes to show that if we let our time get filled sort of without thought, it will get filled. Like, and as you said, it's never done. So stuff will continue to come in and fill our time. But if we let our time get filled without intention, going back to Gena's sort of language, then we won't have time for the golf balls. We won't have time for those things that really matter to us. And so it's so important to prioritize those things that really matter to us, to make the time, put those golf balls into your schedule first. And then, yes, sand will come in and fill around, but that's so important so that at the end of the week, you're looking back and that's where you get the fulfillment. It's like, sure, I've been busy, but I've spent time on these really things that really matter to me, on those relationships, making progress on those passions and that purpose. And then one of the students asked, well, professor, what's the deal with the beer? And he's like, oh, glad you asked. The beer shows that and represents that no matter how full your schedule is, how busy you are, you always have time for a drink with a friend. So Barry, I very much appreciate your glass of wine because we have time for having a drink together with friends. So I think it's so important to keep that in mind as we're thinking about the relationships that we have with our phones, and to carve out the time and make our golf ball times no phone zone so that you're not missing out. So Anna, you have it.
Just a quick note. The beer is really the punchline here. I always think of interintellect as this decadent space that grew out of, these living room gatherings around the world that we were doing in 2019. And this joy of kind of fighting the utility tyranny, that being at an interintellect salon should not make sense. You're not networking. This is not a date. You're not getting hired. There's no goal. It's an infinite game. We come because we want to spend time in a quality way. We want to interact with each other. We want to learn from each other. And that's it. And you have a glass of wine, you put your feet up, and then you move on with your life. And then you come back next week or whenever your next favorite salon is. And I just love that. I hate that I have to call it decadence because I find this being something very constructive. And I hope that the best things in my life will continue to make no sense. Those are the best things. It's infinite games.
Yeah. And absolutely. And it's worthwhile, like going back to that labeling before of what's really worthwhile. Like this is enriching, it's connecting. And sometimes we have to sort of like frame it as indulgent because it makes, like we don't have to. We do as like a defense mechanism of like, oh, it sounds so indulgent that I'm spending this time in this really enriching way. But we shouldn't have to justify it. It is you identifying way of spending time that's really worthwhile for you and prioritizing it. And you don't have to sort of license yourself by, by claiming it as indulgent. It's just worthwhile. Taylor, or I'm not the one calling on people, Matt.
No,
David was first. You go first.
All these professors in the room, I love it. You're used to calling people.
Go ahead, David.
Thanks so much. I was going to ask you, because I wasn't quite clear whether you had a position on this or not, but I kind of love distraction. I kind of adore it because sometimes, as I'm sure you know, is that sometimes some of the best things happen in life by not intervening or by doing nothing or letting something kind of formulate. Some of the best, for me at least, some of the best art happens at the incidence of kind of where negative space meets something positive. And it's the negative space and the sea of negative space and the opportunity of something positive, which is exciting. And also some of the best, for instance, like documentary filmmaking is filmmaking which just kind of enables stuff to sort of happen and emerge. And so I certainly, and I find myself sometimes most productive when I am distracted for a time and then I refocus. And then when I refocus, there's a moment. And then I get distracted again and I refocus and there's a moment. Now, I mean, your view of kind of intentionality, it's almost like, I mean, forgive me if I wasn't listening because you may have put up a kind of defense of distraction, but it feels like there's a kind of hierarchy here whereby, to not be distracted is a really good thing. to have intentionality and have purpose is a really good thing. Whereas we all know that some of the best, most fabulous, most productive moments come in a context of a lack of intentionality, and it kind of can be formulated in a space of distraction. So I just wondered whether, what is there a bit of a morality kicking around here, or something which is about the, distraction bad, non-distraction good, or am I missing the point? And actually, I've been drinking so much, you may well have said it and I missed it.
No, and I didn't say it because
it's dark and dismal days in London and the UK just now, so we have to kind of resort to having a glass of white wine rather early in the evening.
No, it's great. And I actually have been framing distraction as negative. And like, it's interesting because the sort of places of creation that you're talking about, and it's making me wonder of like what you mean by distraction versus what I mean by distraction. Because in the research of the by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, which is he's a psychologist that identified the flow state and the power of being in a flow state where it's transcendent, right? Like you lose all concept of time. You're so fully engaged in what you're currently doing, not distracted by outside inputs. I mean, that's where we are at our best. That's where we do create and produce. And so I'm sort of wondering what, like, I guess I'm sort of wondering what you mean by sort of creation coming out of distraction. And I do there is the work on creativity of like when you're having like a writer's block, for instance, you are meant to sort of leave your desk and go do something else, and then it will sort of churn in the back of your mind such that then when you come back, that you're sort of ready to produce, that you're removing that pressure almost. So I guess question back to you, what do you mean by distraction?
I'm not sure I know, but what I guess what you're making me think about, which is really fantastic, is that I guess my view of this is that we kind of, over the last maybe 10, 20 years, we've kind of learned to function in a non-linear manner, which technology has kind of helped. And that I operate kind of serially in any one moment. And I kind of rather like that. And that's what supports me being creative. And distraction, I think, is probably part of that. Whereas kind of the idea, for instance, for me of flow is that you're utterly focused upon in a rather pure way and a rather minimalist way, actually, in a very focused manner on a particular thing. And that it's by stripping away all of the other interferences that you can therefore be in a flow state and be creative. And then obviously there's a sort of feedback mechanism attached to that. But I do wonder whether in contemporary culture where, we do live serially and in a non-linear manner, that you need to reframe that idea of the virtues and values of distraction and focus and attention. It may mean that obviously that creativity, or there's a short-termism, there's a fragmentation, there's a kind of haphazardness, there's an ugliness, there's a madness attached to that form of creativity, but maybe that's where we are. So I don't know, I'm not answering a question. I think maybe my view of distraction is where you're, very simple thing, where you kind of are not looking at the foreground, you're looking at the background. You're not looking at the plane, you're looking at something else. You're looking basically, in different places at the same time and in parallel. And distraction is, I don't know what distraction is in that context, So if I'm trying to resolve something and I quickly look at Instagram and I quickly get a little dopamine hit of that, and then I go back to my boring as shit sort of spreadsheet, is that I just find the kind of focus and refocusing not a negative. So I don't know. I'm still not answering your question. So,
well,
but I still,
it's
so I don't know what
something-
I think my answer is I don't know what distraction is, except that maybe distraction is a virtue, but I'm repeating myself now.
Yes, well, Gina or Taylor, and we can certainly sort of touch back on this as the conversation unfolds.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm deciding whether to be indulgent and follow up on this quickly or just pass the mic to Taylor. I'm gonna try to strike a balance.
Go for it.
I just want to see if I can quickly like just add a framing that maybe can help, maybe just complicates things more. But I feel like there are lots of different distinctions that sort of float around in the field. There's like divergent versus convergent thinking, and there's like a lot of the different things you're talking about, like thinking more sort of executionally or like in a more exploratory mode. And I think the way that I at least think about intentionality, I'm thinking of it at a meta level where you can be very intentional in choosing to go into an exploratory mode, for example, where it's open-ended, where you're not narrowly constraining the sort of the outcome or the inputs, like even just the idea of there being discretionary time or recreational time suggests that we can choose to block out periods of time where we're open to whatever comes, or we're open to anything within a certain, or we're in a room with friends without an agenda, like here, where I think part of where we have fundamental agency as humans is in deciding where we want the dial to be on the level of constraint and of linearity, if you will, of what we're doing. So I don't know if that helps reconcile some of the seeming differences there.
Taylor, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, so I have 2 points. The first one kind of ties to what Anna was saying earlier about sort of things feeling like indulgent, something like coming to a salon, and in particular things that we often characterize as leisure time. And I've had like a bit of a sort of mind shift change over the past few years of kind of recategorizing a lot of those kinds of activities for myself by asking like, what am I getting out of this? And so, for instance, one of the things that at this point for me is actually a major focus and like dedicated effort of my sort of time management, for lack of a more, poetic term, is building my friendships and building my community, because, I see so many stories of people a few years older than me who are maybe having babies and are now really struggling to like raise them alone because they're far away from their friends. They don't really have a strong support network. And I'm kind of looking to the future and saying, when I want to have kids in a few years' time, like I would like to have like a close network of friends and a community that's like looking out for me. And so at this point, like, I'm not like going into my coffee with my friend being like, this is a community building activity, but in a sense, like when I look at that time, it doesn't feel like, oh, that was just like fun time wasted. Like I'm like, hang on, this has actually got a purpose for my life, which I think is interesting. Yes, I have done that. I've babysat little Alice, which is
yeah.
Is so
that's
we can talk about that.
It's such an important. All right, sorry. Wait, did you?
I have a second point, but
sure.
we can talk about this and then go to that one as well if you want.
Well, this point I do want to highlight because it is such an important one. And if there is any sort of clear takeaway of what are the best investments of our time, it is in investing in those strong relationships, whether it's family or with friends that are going to feel like family. And the research supports that and points to that. There is an interesting longitudinal study conducted. It's called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And basically what it did, it among a cohort of young men in Boston, some Harvard students, some living just in Boston, and it followed them over the course of 75 years. So like their life, And they would sort of touch base with them every few years and ask how they're doing and what they're doing. And at the end of their life, they had this like amazing data to ask the question is like, well, what ultimately predicts satisfaction in life? And it was not wealth, it was not fame, it was not sort of professional accomplishment. It was whether folks had strong supportive relationships, whether again in the form of family or support network of relationships that are there for you and supportive and knowing of you. Even if you look to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that is like on the very bottom are these physiological needs that we need to meet. We need food, water, shelter. So we need safety, health. But the very most fundamental psychological need that we have to address is sense of belonging and connection. And then only once you have that solid foundation of relationships, then is it like sort of moving up the hierarchy towards competence and self-actualization. And then I'm like pulling from lots of different sort of approaches and research speaking to this. And then if you look at time tracking data, both from the research as well as looking at my students' observations from their time tracking. And time tracking is basically over the course of your days for several weeks or a week, what activities are you doing over the course of the days, but also how you're feeling over the course of the day so that you can pull out from the data, what are those activities that tend to be associated with the most positive emotion, that are most satisfying? What are those activities that tend to be associated with the most negative emotion? On average, from the research, as well as observations from my students and their time tracking, is the happiest, most worthwhile, satisfying, fulfilling, joyful activities are those that are genuinely socially connecting, that are those, as you mentioned, coffee with your friend. It is not frivolous. It is not indulgent. It is so important for our happiness. And our happiness is not indulgent. Again, sort of, I didn't share the research earlier because I was like, we don't take, happiness for granted anymore. But sometimes we have to, I mean, in countering some of the language that's been sort of suggestive, like what's indulgent, like is happiness indulgent? No, it's not. It's so important for our moving forward, our resilience, our motivation, how we show up in the world, how we engage with the world. So studies show that when we feel happier, it makes us more creative. It makes us more adaptive in our problem solving, makes us more motivated. So happy employees are more engaged, they're better performers, they're happier in their work, and job satisfaction translates over into life satisfaction. Also, it helps us in our interpersonal relationships. When we are happy, and studies show this, when we feel happier, we like others more, and we are nicer to others. We're more likely to help them out. And there's also studies showing that it helps us in, even with respect to health, when we feel happier, then it increases our thresholds for pain. It increases our immune functioning. It makes us react better to physiological stressors. So all of this is to say that it is important. And even like in the face of the last 2 years, which were so trying and such a struggle, that those who were taking care of their emotional well-being, doing things to make them feel happier through social connection, through exercise, through setting boundaries with time, those are the folks that were more resilient. And those were the folks who were able to show up for both their organizations as well as the individuals in their life more fully. So all to say, Taylor, I want to validate you and encourage you in prioritizing that time to meet up with a friend for coffee. It is about building your tribe. It is about solidifying that sense of belonging and connection, which is so important not just for potentially a future child, but for you and your well-being.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it sometimes feels a bit like I'm doing the weird thing, right? Like no one else seems to be prioritizing this in the same way.
Well, they appreciate it, even though it might be something that they haven't been quite so intentional about. They benefit from it too. Like coming out of an interaction that was genuine and connecting is good for both of you guys. And it's just lucky for them that you're the one that initiated it.
Organized it. Yeah. So my other question is a little bit more on the practical side. And it's something about maybe like whether something that helps you, like, I don't know, fit more into the day is to pay attention to like the density of the needs that are addressed by an activity. And I don't know, maybe you talk about this in the book, but thinking of like, say we have a need for fun, we have a need for exercise, we have a need for socializing. You could play video games and call that fun. You could then meet up with your friend and sit and have a cup of coffee and then go for a run. And that's going to take you 3 hours. Or you could go and do sports in a sport, go play a sport in a sports league. 1 hour where you get exercise, social, and fun all at the same time. And like, I'm wondering whether like being intentional about choosing those kinds of like layered activities can be more effective at really like bringing, like meeting the, like not feeling as if you don't have enough time to get everything you need.
Yeah. Interesting. And so you're sort of picking up on those like aspects, and can you be, the thing that I would want to sort of steer away from is this notion of efficiency versus what's worthwhile. Because also oftentimes in time management, and that's why sometimes I bristle, I'm like, this isn't time management, where it's just the outcome is like productivity, like doing more things makes you, better at managing your time, which is not true. It's about maximizing time and activities that are worthwhile. And interestingly, like in the book, I've approached it in a sort of different way of like in the time tracking exercise of having folks identify what are those activities that felt really good, what are dimensions of them, such that you will prioritize and make time for those. So like if you coming out of a week are like, wow, I really like time when I'm engaging like with others in a team context, that feels connecting. And I really like being outside. And I do see that I have like on average a better mood over the course of the day once I've exercised. Then it's like, oh yes, these are aspects of activities that are really, I do want to craft and put into my week. And so sure, to the extent, and not sure, that sounds like it's like, fine, go do it. But it's like, yes, if there's an activity that allows you to sort of fulfill those features, fantastic. Yes, join that dodgeball league. Did you say dodgeball or kickball? I don't know what you said.
She said sports league generic.
Sports. I don't know. I thought dodgeball sounded really fun.
I play squash, but I understand not everyone does.
But I think that's great. And then it's as long as recognizing that if it does, in fact, make you feel connected and it does give you that mood boost from exercise, then like, yes, that is a worthwhile way of spending time.
Anna,
I just wouldn't want to suggest like bundling like good things together, because then we get back into this distracted thing of like, if you're trying to do too many things at once such that you don't actually get the experience of that connection, for instance, then that's bad. But if your body's moving, then you get the benefits of sports. And being outside, research shows that simply being outside makes us significantly happier. It's a mood boost. Even, and this was David coming out of work in the UK. And it was a really interesting study. and it is using geolocation data. And so they could see at any moment where someone was, and they would ping them and ask, how are you feeling right now? And from that, they identified that simply being outside, even though in the UK, folks are inside 85% of the time, being outside, they were on average happier. Yes, even happier when it was sunny compared to when it was not sunny, and even happier when in a natural environment versus an urban environment. But pulling those effects out, simply being outside versus inside had a significant positive effect on mood. So as you're constructing, Taylor, those activities that will like hit on multiple dimensions, a sport thing that would be outside might be even better.
So does the metaverse or whatever that is, and people spending vast amounts of time in video game land, does that depress you?
Yes, and like from a personal core perspective, absolutely. And I get in this fight with my husband all the time because he's like, that's the future. And I'm like, that is terrible. And I'm not okay with that being the future. But yeah, that's a whole other discussion.
We'll see.
I
want to get to,
sorry.
Sure, yeah, Anna, go ahead.
I think there's a synthesis here, because I think that's not the future. I think it's like with the personal computer, that the fact that we have to be inside to engage with certain types of technology is a phase, but we will be outside and in some virtual space at the same time. So there's something to explore, and it will be how we shape it. So I think it's a really good moment also to not be a fatalist about the future, and I think, okay, if there are really, really good ideas and really good research on time crafting, we can build that into the technology of the future. At least that's why, not that I can do it, but I try.
Okay, other Anna Young.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I have, my thoughts are kind of all over the place on that. On that note, I guess it just makes me think of some of the like eco-psychology research that's showing even having some sort of like nature screensaver on your computer, and even staring at it for a couple seconds does so much to like lower stress and increase like satisfaction and all sorts of stuff like that. So there's all those like interesting ways that I think technology and outdoor spaces can kind of be integrated. And then there's also, you know, speaking from personal experience, to be able to say, oh yes, and there's nothing like being fully immersed in nature without technology or anything like that. But then I also wanted to say to Taylor's point, I think there's a term in time research called time deepening, which is this idea that we have around always feeling like we feel like we're busy and there's always so much going on and so much to do in our time. And so if we can just fit more and more and more and more into what we're doing, kind of overlay, okay, I'll be socializing, but I'll also be exercising at the same time and doing this and doing this and doing this. And I think that kind of brings me to my question. So a lot of my research is focused on time awareness, and I find in focusing on that, and it's very similar, Cassie, to the work that you're doing. I find with myself and with my clients kind of getting into this this dissonance a little bit sometimes of feeling, okay, I want to be intentional about how I'm using my time and how I'm thinking about my time. But sometimes it then stops me from being present because I'm so focused on, okay, am I sequencing everything well? And am I making a good use of my time? And then it's like, wait, no, I'm not being intentional because I'm not being present, and kind of get caught in the like, how do you stay intentional, but also allow yourself to be present and be in the moments where it's not a conscious thought of, oh, is this a good use of time, but just living it. So I'm curious if you could speak at all, if you've had similar experiences, or if you could speak to that.
Yeah. And what you're getting to is that sort of pressure, right, that we put on, it's like, oh my gosh, every moment matters. I'm being super intentional and spending it, and like, oh my gosh, it has to like have the biggest impact, or else I've somehow messed up, or it somehow feels like a waste if you're not feeling everything that you potentially could and, you know, like should be feeling. And I think that that is important to be sensitive to and sort of catch yourself from. And there's interesting work that shows that people who are motivated to be happy, like if their goal is every day, I'm going to be happy, then actually it has a backlash effect and people are less happy because of this pressure thing. It's like this constant, like, am I happy now? Am I happy now? And if you're not like wonderfully happy, then you like penalize yourself. And it has that negative emotional effect. And so the thing that I would say is, having identified what matters to you, both from like a values perspective of like social connection matters, say, or and then also from an activities perspective, like spending time in this way, I have noted in the past, like really brings me joy. I want to prioritize time for these sort of joyful experiences. Is like, I agree and hear that you like, you can't go into it like with that pressureful state. But it does, the intentionality helps, because from the time jar perspective, it allows you actually at least to make the time, to create the opportunity for that. And sometimes it's actually, and I talk about this in the book too, of like creating time for nothing. Like, and sometimes we have to create that time or else it will get filled by all this other stuff. So it's like the best that you can do is sort of set up and create the opportunities. And by being thoughtful, is like, okay, this is time for this, knowing that I will get work done later, because I've been sort of very deliberate of like setting aside hours for that, so that it doesn't pull you out of the moment of like, oh my gosh, should I be doing all these other things? It's like, no, this is time that I've given myself for this activity, and it at least creates the opportunity to be in it, which is countering that sort of, you know, always doing and going mode. So I'm not totally answering your question, other than saying that I hear you and I agree that you have to not put so much pressure on the time. Because it sounds like you're in the like recognizing that time is so precious and making the most of it. And then how do you not just put pressure on every moment such that you feel
it's kind of like if you looked at everybody in your life and you're like, everybody in my life has to be like my best friend. Like they all have to be this like intense, intimate, you know, like when it's like there are peaks, like you want a range of people in your life and you want to give it space to develop, and you want to recognize that there are like peaks and valleys, and it's like time is like that too. It's like there are going to be times of like really intense joy and times of like work and time. And this is what I like about your metaphor of the time mosaic, where you're like, you can track your time and you can think about it at the level of a week or the level of a month or the level of your life, and you can kind of like paint a picture, and it is a mosaic, like there are different parts of it. So
yeah. And the analogy that Matt is talking about, and this is actually a helpful thing to point out too, that the perspective that folks take on their time has, in our work we have found, has an effect. So we found that people who think about their time in terms of years and their life overall, as opposed to thinking hour by hour, are actually happier. So those that take this broader time perspective, we find experience more positive emotion in their days, a greater sense of meaning. And the reason that I think that comes into play is because taking this broader perspective, which maybe actually this is partly an answer to your question, that it's not like hour by hour, like this is life. It's like life is life, years is life. And what that does is it clarifies what is important to you? What are your values? What are your purpose? And that can inform how you spend your hours, and does inform. And so we find that folks who take this broader time perspective are more likely to spend more time on activities that feel important, irrespective of how urgent. So often we are driven by urgency of like incoming requests that are urgent, irrespective of how actually important they are. And those are those things that fill our time. And the research also shows that when people feel like they don't have a lot of time, they are more likely to react to what's urgent and ignoring the importance of it. And so, yeah, I think that perspective of thinking about life overall, which informs how you spend your hours, as opposed to like, maybe like every hour, here we go, like this is my entire life. And that's where Matt's point, that the mosaic perspective is that. So instead of thinking, what is my next hour and how am I going to spend it, where there's a lot of trade-offs that is in your next hour, like, am I going to do this or am I going to do this? And it feels like an all or nothing decision. And often it pits things that you care about, both like care about each of these against each other. Whereas when you take this mosaic perspective, thinking about a week overall or even a month overall, and it's not a question of whether I'm going to spend my time in one way or another, it's really when am I going to spend my time on these different activities and different things that I care about. And so you can sort of, it's less pressureful because each moment is just a part of the bigger picture. It is like each of these are tiles within the broader mosaic, and that takes pressure away from each tile, right? It's like, it's just part of the broader, not just part, it's like, is part of this broader, beautiful picture, mosaic that's colorful and complex, and that is your life. So maybe that helps take the pressure off too.
It makes me think a little bit about.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I'll just go quickly. It makes me think about the conversation with David about distractions and kind of how we think about happiness, where if, we can't always be at our peak happiness, it's the fact that we can kind of ebb and flow into these moments of peak happiness and then kind of out of them. And so having those moments of distraction is just as important as having those moments of focus, and it kind of allows us to then ebb and flow back in and out of them. Yeah, thank you.
Anna?
I'll be very quick because I know we're nearing the hour. So on the point of distraction, I love that Cassie immediately picked up on this possibly being a linguistic question, because for instance in French also distraction is the same word as entertainment. So I think what David might have meant here is entertainment, abandon, kind of letting go of the control freakness, but it's not the same as being distracted. What you mean, I think, Cassie, is more like interruption, is you want to do something, you're in the flow and you are constantly dragged out from it. I completely forgot what I wanted to say. Yeah, I will send you guys an email.
That's really helpful though, because I actually think that that does make sense. And then when David, you were talking about like, yes, it helps, like if I want to go and check on what's happening on my phone, then there's some sort of benefit of that. And that's in framing it as entertainment and like these other sort of inputs and ways of spending time, then that I agree. And actually, I'm sorry, Anna, that I was saying Anna, and you obviously pronounce your name Anna, and Anna, I don't know how it's Anna or Anna.
I think all Annas and Annas of the world, if there are two N's in the middle, we will listen to it. I think that's the general consensus amongst all Annas of the world. Am I correct in this?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that the pulling in the mosaic idea into that is very helpful. So, yay.
Actually, I remember what I wanted to ask, but I think it's a longer question, and I will ask maybe in an email or on Twitter, which is that, as you're teaching your students as a professor, these techniques and these ways of reframing, I would love to just hear how many people you've seen change their lives or their attitude. And because for me, running Interact, I literally see people's faces every day, and I see how people learn to flourish. And this is the greatest gift in my life that I've never dreamed of having. And I can imagine that when one is a teacher of time crafting, you actually see people change. And that just must be an incredible experience.
It is so rewarding, and seeing it and hearing my students share at the end of the quarter, like both I collect data and I find that they're happier and more connected and have a greater sense of meaning. But when a student will come and tell me, it's like, this course saved my marriage. This course made it so that when my mom passed, I didn't feel regret. Like, that is really powerful. And I've been getting, I mean, like, in hearing it from my students over the years and seeing it is just so profoundly moving and motivating. And now actually with the book out, and now there's been enough time that people have read it, and actually hearing from them, Gena, I'm sorry that I made you cry, but like, it's hearing how the book is actually even shifting how they engage with the people they love, and hearing how they are spending their time and prioritizing enriching activities, which has been really fun hearing about, very busy moms that have never prioritized their own enrichment, and all of a sudden are signing up for these activities that are fulfilling and wonderful. And so I'm absolutely moved by the effect of it.
Thank you, Cassie. And I sadly have to sign off on that note, but please keep doing what you're doing, and thank you. And thank you all.
I think we're at the end of our time, right? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it was a treat. Thank you all.
It was a treat. I got to one of my 12 questions. So
Thank you, Cassie.
There will be an email thread after this. Thank you so much, everybody. And Cassie, this has been an
yeah.
absolute privilege.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Amazing,
much.
Cassie. Really interesting. Thank you so much.
Really
Thank
interesting
you
stuff.
all.
And just if you're listening, either attending live or listening to the recording, and you haven't checked out the book, I do recommend it. I'm pretty picky about this sort of thing, and like I don't like this kind of thing unless I think it's really good, and I think it is really, it's like surprisingly philosophical and really helpful. So it has the full Matt Bateman recommendation. And how should people like keep tabs on you, Cassie?
Well, I'm not really on social media, but actually I am on LinkedIn. You can LinkedIn connect with me, and then my website, Cassie M. Holmes. That's where my research is and where I am in the world. So,
well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and great meeting you, other Anna, as well. Talk to you.
Right.
Soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening.